Okay, let's unpack something pretty unexpected today. There's new data coming out of the Czech Republic. It's from a really comprehensive national study,
Hmm.
and it seems to indicate a pretty significant difference in birth rates, specifically between women who were vaccinated against COVID-19 and those who weren't.
Yeah, noticeably fewer births, apparently, in the vaccinated group.
Exactly. So the immediate question, I think, for me and probably for you listening is just what's going on here? What's behind this?
Well, I think the first thing that jumps out is just the sheer scale of this data. It's quite something.
It really
We're
is.
not talking about, a small sample or one region. This is nationwide. It tracked 1.3 million women aged 18 to 39.
Wow.
Yeah, looking specifically at their COVID-19 vaccination status, and then critically whether they had a successful conception leading to a live birth.
Yeah.
Getting that kind of data population-wide is incredibly rare.
It really is. And, this deep dive was really sparked by seeing Dr. John Campbell analyze this very data recently. He was discussing a paper referencing work by Dr. Viva Manica, looking right into these trends.
Right.
And the key thing to grasp, like you said, is the scale. It's almost all women in that key reproductive age group across the entire country.
That kind of data set just gives us a unique window, doesn't it?
Yeah,
Usually we're working with, much smaller snapshots, maybe more localized.
definitely.
So this level of detail, it might reveal patterns you'd otherwise completely miss.
So, okay, our aim today is really just to dig into this. We want to look at the main patterns that seem to be emerging from this check data,
Mm-hmm.
explore some of the potential biological ideas that the source suggests might be at play, and, think about why this info might matter to you, the listener.
Right. And importantly, we're focusing on what the data shows and the ideas presented in the source. We're not jumping to conclusions here or taking sides.
Not at all, just presenting the findings.
So to start, it probably makes sense to look at the bigger picture first. Like, what were the overall birth rate trends in the Czech Republic during this time?
Good point. That context is crucial. The data does show a pretty clear downward trend overall.
Okay.
So in 2021, the total fertility rate was 1.83 births per thousand women. Then in 2022, it dropped to 1.62,
Right.
and then down again in 2023 to 1.45. So yeah, definitely a general decline in births happening in the country anyway.
Okay, so that overall drop is the backdrop. Now, the source talks about a key graphic, a visual representation of the data comparing the groups. Can you walk us through that?
Absolutely. So imagine this graph tracking births from January 2021 right through to December 2023. There are 3 lines.
Mm-hmm.
You've got a red line showing all births. Then a blue line that's specifically births to women who hadn't had a COVID-19 vaccine.
Okay.
And then there's a green line representing births to women who had been vaccinated. And this green line is, well, it's significantly lower.
Lower, and how consistent is that gap?
That's the striking thing. It's really consistent. There's this very noticeable, persistent gap between the blue line, the unvaccinated births, and the green line, the vaccinated births, pretty much throughout that whole 3-year period.
And the source tries to quantify that difference, right? Like, how big are we talking?
Yeah, they put a number on it. Overall, the indication is that birth rates were around 30% lower in the vaccinated women compared to the unvaccinated.
30%, wow.
Yeah. And they give a specific snapshot, too. Like, around the end of June 2021, at that point, about 39% of women in this age group were vaccinated.
Okay.
But those vaccinated women specifically, those vaccinated before a successful conception, they only accounted for 7% of all the successful conceptions leading to birth around that time.
So a much smaller percentage of births than their proportion in the population would suggest.
Exactly. And it wasn't just early on. The source also notes that even in 2022, the rate of successful conceptions stayed about 1.5 times higher for unvaccinated women.
That's really interesting, especially when you consider how vaccination rates changed over time. Did the source cover that?
It did. The graphic shows that the percentage of women getting vaccinated climbed quite steadily through 2021,
Right.
and then it sort of plateaued, leveled off around the 70% mark by the end of that year.
Okay, so uptake slowed down.
Yeah. But what's interesting is that even after the vaccination rate stabilized around that 70%, this lower conception rate observed in the vaccinated group, well, it continued. It didn't just disappear once uptake slowed.
Which naturally makes you think about, well, why? Are there other factors, potential biases maybe, that could explain this difference? The source must acknowledge that, right? Correlation isn't causation.
Oh, absolutely. And that's a really, really critical point they make. The source itself flags the possibility, and it's just a possibility that women who were actively trying for a baby might have been, more cautious or hesitant about getting vaccinated.
Okay, that makes sense as a potential factor.
And conversely, maybe women who definitely weren't planning a pregnancy felt, more comfortable getting the vaccine.
So, differing intentions could definitely skew the numbers. People self-selecting into groups based on their pregnancy plans.
Precisely. It's a classic confounding variable issue.
Mhm.
These findings are, as the source stresses, hypothesis generating. They point to something interesting, but don't prove why it's happening.
Right. And accepting that caution, the source then does go on to explore some potential biological mechanisms, doesn't it? Things that could theoretically play a role.
Yes, it does. And this is where it gets into some more specific biological possibilities mentioned.
Yeah.
So, first off, they mention the known documented effects that COVID-19 vaccines have had on menstrual cycles for some women. Changes in timing, flow, maybe pain, that's been reported.
Right, the menstrual disturbances.
Then they raise the idea of possible impacts on endometrium. That's the lining of the womb.
Yeah, where the embryo implants.
Exactly. So could there be an effect there? And thirdly, there's mention of some recent reports suggesting direct effects of the Pfizer vaccine, specifically on ovarian follicles.
The follicles being where the eggs develop.
Correct. The little sacs in the ovaries holding the eggs. So potential impacts there, too.
So possible effects at different points, the cycle itself, the implantation site, maybe even egg development. What about the spike protein idea? Does that come up?
It does, yeah. That's another angle they explore. One hypothesis mentioned is whether the spike protein itself, which, your body learns to make after the vaccine, could circulate and perhaps affect ovarian tissue directly, or maybe interfere somehow with the implantation process.
Okay.
And one final biological point they touch on is the possibility of very, very early pregnancy losses.
Like before someone even knows they're pregnant.
Potentially, yeah. The idea being maybe immunological shifts after vaccination could, in some cases, lead to loss at such an early stage, it wouldn't even be recognized as a pregnancy.
Wow. Okay, so quite a few potential biological avenues being suggested, but all needing more investigation.
Absolutely, and the source is very clear on that. These are potential mechanisms, things to look into. The study itself, or the paper discussing it, flags the limitations.
Right.
It stresses that this kind of detailed, nationwide data linking vaccination and birth outcomes is actually quite rare. The Czech Republic is one of the few places we have it from currently.
So we can't necessarily generalize easily.
Exactly, and the conclusion reported is basically, these are preliminary results. They
Okay.
generate hypotheses, ideas to test. But we definitely need more studies to really understand if and how COVID-19 vaccination might affect fecundability, the ability to conceive, and overall fertility.
And they also raised a point about the original trials, didn't they?
They did. A concern was noted that reproductive health impacts weren't really assessed thoroughly in the initial vaccine clinical trials.
Right. So thinking bigger picture then, beyond the check data, what about the wider implications mentioned?
Well, the source briefly touches on the growing concern globally about falling birth rates in many developed countries.
Yeah, that's a huge topic in itself.
It is. And so these findings from the Czech Republic, even with all the caveats, they kind of highlight why it's so important to get more data like this from other countries. We need to see if similar patterns show up elsewhere and just generally understand the drivers behind these global birth rate trends better.
It really emphasizes the need for more comprehensive tracking and research in this whole area.
Definitely.
Okay, so if we were to kind of wrap up the main points from this deep dive into the check data.
I think the core finding, the thing that stands out, is this documented significant difference in successful conception rates, those leading to live births, between the vaccinated and unvaccinated women in the Czech Republic during that 2021-2023 period.
Yeah, based on this very large nationwide data set.
Right, 1.3 million women. And it shows this consistent pattern. Lower reported birth rates in the group vaccinated before conception compared to the unvaccinated group.
Which leaves us and you, the listener, with a really important question to mull over, doesn't it?
I think so.
Considering everything we've discussed, the findings, but also the big caveats, the potential biases, the correlation, not causation issue. What kind of further research or what sort of data collection do you think is most crucial now?
Yeah, what do we need to understand these trends better? And, what might the impact be on society down the line?
It just highlights how complex these intersections of public health, individual choice, and population trends really are. There aren't easy answers.
Not at all. And look, this deep dive, it's really just intended as a starting point for understanding this specific piece of data and the discussion around it.
Hmm.
If it's got you thinking, we definitely encourage you to, maybe look up the study referenced in the source material, explore related research yourself.
Absolutely. It's always important to seek out different perspectives, reliable sources, and just keep learning as more information becomes available on these really significant ongoing trends.